I want to take you on a bit of a journey through the story of Mechanics Institutes. Not this sort of. Oh, here we go again. Sorry. Okay, not this sort of Mechanics Institute. You know, so many people that come across the link of, Arthur Street Mechanics Institute or Tallarook Mechanics Institute. Is that all about mechanics? Well, no, it's not. Mechanics Institute is all about the 1700s, the 18th century, linking to the age of both the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution in Britain. The term mechanics came from artisans or working people. So firstly, let's get that context. It's really important that we do that and understand what we're talking about. Now, as the band begins to play, let's look for some common ground. Maybe we can do a bit of speed dating. Not maybe. Perhaps we really do need to do a bit of speed dating. So, like the fleeting moments of the barn dance, we seek to find some common ground, your historical society and our whole story or social context most likely share many common elements. Here we are celebrating Anzac 100 commemorations, but the Mechanics Institute story begins well before last century. So let's look at some common elements with that era. Some things don't change. The set dances of another era today, in fact actually in this hall last Saturday at our Irish Ceilidh. So some things are transferable. But if we travel back in time to Britain, mid-17th century, we begin to get a glimpse of the content of, or the context of Mechanics Institutes. It's music of a different sound. And we've got the hurdy-gurdy player of the 1700s here, a piece of porcelain. So the 17th and 18th century were times to dance too. Two significant social contexts were in play, the Age of Enlightenment, as I mentioned, and the Industrial Revolution, both game changers in the world view. And of course, in that era, it was the grounding in some ways, the exploration of the Grand Tour. But of course, the Grand Tour really was only for the elite. But it brought into mind some countless numbers of names, whether it be Chippendale, or whether it be Heppelwaite, or Gillows, or Sheraton in terms of furniture, whether it was Piranesi, Giovanni Piranesi, who was a Roman artist, and his work, in the top left, was simply made for the tourist, the Grand Tour tourist. But it became like a postcard. And of course, the innovations of the Georgians in so many different contexts is something that's been carried on and on and on. And of course, the East India Company, for decades a law unto itself, plied the seas. They were the carrier of exotic cultural objects and new foods from across the sea. Tea, of course, is a great example, and so is porcelain, Chinese porcelain. So the Age of Enlightenment, and look, I'm going to rush through that, but critically, the Age of Enlightenment was a period known as the long 18th century because it went from late 1600s through to late 1800s, and one that combined with the Industrial Revolution. It was considered an intellectual and philosophical movement which dominated Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries and had global influences and effects. And it concluded a range of ideas centred on the value of human happiness and pursuit of knowledge. Now, why do I have that as part of the backing? It became a platform for, via the Industrial Revolution, a change in thinking, a specific change in thinking. Of course, the Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the 1790s, and was not fully felt until the 1830s or 40s. It had equipped Britain to become an enhanced innovator and manufacturing power, and that came with a change in mindset. The transition included going from hand production methods, you would know that, to machines, new chemical manufacturing and iron production processes, the increasing use of water power and steam power, the development of machine tools and the rise of the mechanised factory systems. What's all that mean to do with Mechanics Institutes? In Scotland, as workers became more skilled, a growing need was emerging. The workers or artisans were referred to as mechanics, and these mechanics sought training opportunities. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Of course, this was controversial because many of the employers and upper class influencers were suspicious at that stage of too much enlightenment of the lower classes for fear of revolution and so on. I don't know whether they'd read the newspaper about France or Russia or whatever. However, despite that, in 16th of October 1821, the School of Arts of Edinburgh, and its mission was for the instruction of mechanics, artisans or working men, in such branches as of physical science of practical application in their several trades. And they held the first lecture in chemistry, would you believe? In chemistry at St Cecilia's Concert Hall in the Old Town in Scotland. Note that within 30 years of this first lecture, there were 700 mechanics institutes in Britain, and already the movement had spread to America and Australia. Now, St Cecilia's Concert Hall is where the first lecture was, a very grand setting for a very humble, a very humble beginning to this process of creating establishments that would enhance and educate and enthuse the lower classes. Mechanics institutes, they spread quickly. They were funded by local industrialists. In Australia, we often refer to them as schools of arts, and note there, they were more likely run by middle classes. The provision of reading rooms, museums, lectures, classes, still important, but the Australian schools were also more likely to include a social program in their calendar of events. And last but not least, in fact it applied to this building, they often included libraries. And Arthur's Creek Mechanics Institute, even I remember in my day, had glass case bookcases in the what was the dressing room of the back room as a lending library. Come back to that a little bit later. Now, the Mechanics Institute of Victoria, of which I'm a committee member, has a mission to preserve all that's associated with, in a way, the threatened breed of mechanics institutes. And so, to foster the preservation and restoration of the social, cultural and physical heritage of mechanics institutes, to encourage and facilitate the recognition and preservation of mechanics institutes and the revival of inactive mechanics institutes located in Victoria. So this is really an umbrella body that is out there as the champion for mechanics institutes. In fact, I had a phone call from a person connected to a mechanics institute relatively close here, no names mentioned, but concerned that, like many, carrying a committee of 4 trustees, 3 of which had moved on, and this final trustee was a gentleman of 86 years old. Now I know, Robert, you're a great example of an active 80 odd years, but this man was feeling almost desperate in terms of what's going to happen to our facility. And I suspect that you can all relate to that challenge, and it is a challenge, especially when we put so much importance on what our institutes can offer. Okay, so MIV I'll refer to, picks up the context of mechanic and artisan, it picks up the context of mostly consisting of local volunteers that provided and maintained a venue and facilitated community classes and events. Volunteers is the key word that comes out of there. They were also precursors of adult education and libraries in Victoria. First Mechanics Institute in the colonies was in Hobart, 1827. The second was Sydney Mechanics Institute. It's interesting, isn't it, that Hobart was the first Mechanics Institute, Sydney followed. And that was 1833, then Newcastle in 1835. From the 1850s, Mechanics Institutes quickly spread through Victoria, wherever a hall, library or school was needed. So over 1,200 Mechanics Institutes were built in Victoria, but only 500 remain. Now, probably a familiar sight, and I wonder how many of you here, and certainly how many people that walk along Collins Street, would recognise the Athenaeum as our first Mechanics Institute in Melbourne. And the Athenaeum is a vital Mechanics Institute for Melbourne, and in fact for the whole Mechanics Institute movement. It was established in 1839, and of course we possibly know it more commonly as the Athenaeum Theatre, but if you go and explore that centre, there is the Athenaeum Library, and it provides not just a lending library, but it's also an archive library, and critical in the preservation of information. So we continue to celebrate the Mechanics Institute story, and I'm going to whip through this slide because I could get bogged down on it. We all have stories to tell. What does that mean? One of my catchcries here is with our meetings, trying to encourage those around the table to contribute to the story of not just the hall, but the story of their life, if you like. I have been encouraging, give it a go with a 2-minute talk. Bring an object, bring a story, bring a photograph, and try and share it in 2 minutes. Now, I volunteer as a guide with the Johnson Collection, and part of our training is fairly constantly talk about an object or something for 2 minutes to get the focus on what the critical things are you want to share. So we do all have stories to tell, and we should all put a value on the stories that we've got to tell. So, who's this man? It's Jim Loudon, and now Jim was from Kilmore and had a significant role in the, without exaggerating, the battle over the Kilmore Mechanics Institute when it was demolished. You may well be aware of that. But as a result of that, Jim's passion for Mechanics Institute led to him leading the formation of Mechanics Institute of Victoria. Another person linked to Arthur's Creek, Ken Murphy, and I know he's linked to your group as well, and I'm pretty certain Ken is a life member of your group. But Ken came from a long-standing Arthur's Creek family. He wrote a number of publications, as did his father, Jim. And he was a member of your group. And last but not least, Bruce Draper. Now, Bruce was a local, his great-grandparents, Charles and Catherine, settled in the district in the 1860s. Bruce's father, Chester, and Robert's father, Chester, well-known source of local history of the district and families of the original settlers. Again, Bruce was a prolific gatherer and publisher, but he also was a long-term member of our committee. So, I put this at this stage, contributing references, because it just highlights, and again, I'm not going to go further, but it does highlight, and hopefully some of the material up the back of the room highlights, there's this plethora of information that we have access to. But that comes as with a challenge of managing it. And I suspect it's even more of a challenge for you to manage all of that collection, not having a home. We're fortunate that we've got a roof over our head, and still it comes with challenges because a lot of it still ends up in my study and other people's studies. Okay, so Mechanics Institutes come in many and varied images, and every one of these buildings has a story that we could dwell on, but we won't. We were recognised by the Mechanics Institute of Victoria as a valued institution, and one of the critical things for us is that we are one of the few mechanics institutes that are totally independent. Now, a lot of mechanics institutes are managed or influenced or controlled by either local government or other bodies. That has an advantage of perhaps having funds sent from a constant source, whereas our situation, totally independent, we celebrate not being mandated, but on the other hand means every single dollar, every single improvement, every single piece of maintenance, we have to fund. You know, it costs us close to $13,000 a year just to keep the doors open. So that's a lot of money needed to be gathered before we install this sort of system, before we maintain the inside and the outside, before we develop the grounds. So there's always the pluses and minuses, isn't there? But it does bring us to Arthur's Creek in 1887. Now, in 1878, nearly a decade before, a young painter called Harry Harwood did this painting of Arthur's Creek. The 19th century, of course, did continue, and Harry completed his painting ahead of the hall being built. So, whilst recognising generations of Indigenous owners of this land, we'll move to the relative contemporary Arthur's Creek story. And as I said, it's a short story of Arthur's Creek. In the early 19th century, pre the Duffy Land Act, which was a significant Act of Parliament of 1862, white settlement at Arthur's Creek was firstly through Batman, John Batman, then Henry Arthur, who was linked with Batman's explorations, and in 1844, Patrick Reed took over the squatting licence for Stewart Ponds, which was a large run to the west of Arthur's Creek and linked around the Drapers, Barton Hill area of Yanyuning or Doreen. After 1862, the first selectors in the area were Charles Draper and John Ryder, and they shared base on the western side of this valley, and changed the, changed the environment for a significant amount of time. Looking back to the Reed family, Patrick and Agnes were the first Reeds to take up residence, and William Reed. The Reed family celebrated 150 years of continuous occupancy and extend that today. That was in 1994, extended today, and that's 180 years of continuous occupancy. So it's a long story that they have. And of course, Charles Draper and John Ryder, the first two selectors, were granted their rights after the Duffy Land Act. And again, each of those have long stories to tell. So, we're getting into the speed dating. 1873, the Methodist Church was built across the road. Now the Methodist Church is now the home of Arthur's Creek Community Centre, ACCC as it's known. And just harking back to the 1950s, a little group of Sunday school children, many of whom still have links with the community actually. Then next to open in the district was 1876, the school, Arthurs Creek Primary School. You can see teachers there, but Frederick Hammett was at the school for nearly 20 years, and this is Frederick and his wife as the sewing mistress for the school. And you can see it's a pretty healthy enrolment.
Yeah.
1886, 11th of March, a preliminary meeting of persons interested in the creation of a hall for the purposes of recreation, etc., was held at the school. The notice in the Evelyn Observer and the Age read, "Tenders are invited in our advertising columns for the erection of a mechanics institute at Arthurs Creek." We start to see some of the material that we have in our collection of minute books and so on. And it also, I just make this point, it's part of the challenge of many groups like ours with old material is to accurately decipher what's in these books. Without dwelling too much, I heard just recently somebody who, a lady in her golden years, but she had taken up a role with the Canberra War Museum as a transcriber, because she could read this sort of print and accurately translate it onto computer. A dying skill, but really an essential skill that it's like, I guess, like any interpreter. But this becomes a bit of a challenge, but I assure you my interpretation of the article and the minutes is correct on this one. Okay, we've got a photo here of Joe Murphy. Now Joe was one of the first trustees of the Mechanics Institute, and he's the grandfather of Ken Murphy that we were talking about before. Now, without stalling, but I want you to look at those dates. 13th of August 1886, January 87, February 87, March 87, May 87, July 87, Friday the 2nd of September 87, formal opening William Reid Esquire JP officiated, and the report was there were about 40 couples present. A program of 21 dances was finished a little after 5 o'clock in the morning. So they were pretty hearty residents of Arthurs Creek, and probably they had to get back home to start maybe milking the cows in the morning. To a degree that used to happen with the fire brigade balls here too. Okay, the hall drawings, interesting, it says there the dressing room and the outside steps. The bottom third of the hall is new, and you'll see a line, if you look, you'll see that join. And the other interesting point is the kitchen. That was the library on this side where the kitchen is now. There was then an extension of this as a dressing room, and in fact there was stairs up to the dressing room. And again, as a kid I remember accessing those for our school concerts. You also note at the moment there's no, on the original plan, no fireplace. So it wasn't as warm as we are now. Okay, Arthurs Creek Mechanics Institute Free Library, Rules and Regulations 1888. And without dwelling on these again, but it was interesting, the very first item on the list is that members' subscription of 5 shillings per annum is to be paid in advance at 2 shillings and 6pence per half year. So it was a pretty high value of the facility. In 1888, not long after the hall was built, the Ronish piano. Now, this is the Ronish, it's not that one. This is number 3 in line of pianos at the hall. But the Ronish, I have a bit of an ongoing, I was going to say battle, challenge, to ensure that the Ronish, which is stored out in these sheds, is maintained as a heritage item. We stopped using it because we couldn't keep it in tune, but again, perhaps you'll empathise with items that you want to keep, but how the devil do we keep them? And of course the Ronish so early became the centrepiece of entertainment in the hall. Now another group who was in the background but formally consolidated, 1890, the Arthurs Creek Fruit Growers Association. You have to remember that all of this area was mostly farmed as orchards, apple, pear, cherries, some citrus, some stone fruit, but apple, pear particularly. And of course Acted's orchard is still a strong apple, pear business. But the Arthurs Creek Fruit Growers formed the 1890 umbrella group, and they were champions of the local and international orchard interests. The beginnings of what would later evolve into Arthurs Creek Progress Association. Next in line, a year later, 1899, the post office. The post office was built. Prior to that, the post office service was at the school, and good old Mr. Hammett, as well as being head teacher, was also postmaster in his spare time. So this was built by William Murphy, who says teachers aren't resilient and resourceful. William Murphy built the post office, and it was a post office and store. Mechanics Institute Free Library, again, rules and regulations revisited 1908, but good to see their financial viability is of prime importance, because you could still, no inflation then, you could still be a member for 5 shillings a year are payable in advance at the rate of 2 shillings and 6pence half yearly. We won't dwell on this, but there's a couple of really interesting points here. The first one, 1889, note the picket fence, which we've re-erected, but a chimney for the library. So interesting. Talked about the post office, the circulating library opens, and Mr. Hammett, not only head teacher, not only postmaster, but he also read a paper on the peach aphis. Church of England services at the hall, and the Arthurs Creek Band has members. And again, as a kid, I remember in those big glass cabinets, there was a tuba, big brass silver tuba, a trumpet, and a couple of other brass instruments. Okay, another thing, construction of the stable block. Of course, people coming for entertainment needed to house their horse. Debating club, bushfire relief after the fires of 1890, welcome home, Boer War, the extension action, 1903, the shelter shed just next door was interestingly not put up by the education department, but was established with funds raised by the hall. Telegraph line, monthly fundraising socials for the war effort, welcome home functions, a Gloria light system which was very sophisticated using pressurised petrol or shallite, and the 50th anniversary celebrations. Just a snapshot. Now, Arthurs Creek Fruit Growers Association was a prominent catalyst for our community, and here the well-dressed and prosperous-looking group assembled for a field day in 1913. And that crowd certainly was a significant crowd. Now, as well as fruit growers and all of the initial activities, this place was hopping with use. Many diverse groups used the hall as their base: tennis clubs, rifle clubs, football club, cricket club, brass band, and of course a debating club. The library continued to function, and the railway committee, church services and fruit growers association continued to use the hall. The railway committee, interesting, there was a strong lobby group with the local orchardist to have a rail link from Hurstbridge to transport fruit directly into the Melbourne market. Didn't happen. Probably just as well for us. The 1938 Jubilee celebration, the crowds gather to celebrate that, Again, the number of people is amazing for that time, but I want to point it's a fascinating photo to study, but A, the picket fence,
Yeah.
B, the shelter shed, C, the church, and if you look in this corner, and I only just sort of found this a couple of days ago, the stable block.
Oh.
Yeah. There's a story about the stable block in that the latest heritage audit, we got notification that the only item on, only structure on our site was the original stable block, and I queried it, and finally won the case that what they defined as the stable block was the last shed that was our most recent construction on the other side of the toilet. So we now no longer have a stable block. The stable block was taken down in about late 30s, 1930s. But we were really pleased because it meant that our design for that storage shed was quite sympathetic to the era. Okay, 1954. Despite low numbers, the school continued to be a critical part of the community. 12 students gone down with Mr. Alan Simmons as the head teacher. 1959, 22 pupils with Mr. Alan Fidock. There's a smart young lad there.
Oh.
1962, a sad day, one of our earliest entities destroyed by fire, the school. And the hall became the schoolhouse. There's a great school photograph of 1964 students who were then based in the hall for their school. Interesting, only 3 girls, one of them was my sister, my younger sister. But there's a great collection of family collections there. There's the 2 Pugh boys who were Clifton Pugh's sons. There's the 3 Laycock kids who were Helen and Helen and her husband. Isn't that terrible? Anyway, the Laycock family Potters at Dunmurchan. So at this stage there was quite a shift in the distribution of young families. Dunmurchan and Arthur's Creek farming families. Changing times, okay, yeah, by the late 40s, early 50s, things started to go downhill for the hall. The broken picket on the picket fence perhaps as an indicator there. And in fact the Progress Association that was running simultaneous with the hall committee took over the running of the hall for a long periods, 1966 and 1974. If we keep on moving forward, 1987, a century old, the hall's a century old, and there was a significant celebration of that, and in fact Cyril Cations was the man who, Cyril here, was the man who unveiled the plaque. Cyril had an interesting story in that he was born in Geelong. He actually was captain of the Geelong in the VFA in 1924. Here he is on the left. Then his family moved up to the post office to become postmaster in the 30s. Cyril's constantly remembered, not just with having opened the plaque, but we celebrate Cyril's contribution to the district. He made a generous bequest, and in fact every time we switch on the lights we think of Cyril Cation because that's where we utilised his contribution. 52, the library closes. 61, electric light connected. And up on the resource table up there I have a recording of the whole concert and opening of the turning on of the power. And the interior of the hall was painted for the first time. Can you believe? Okay, there it is here. It was so modern. We had a salmon colour on the doors. We had buttercup yellow on some walls, and the main stage was powder blue. And of course, in the 80s, there was a rejuvenation in the hall and highlighting local talent and a community gathering place again. 87 hall celebrations for the century of the hall. We have going on from 89, 36 continuous events of Garden Walk, which is our major community activity really, major fundraiser, but a terrific event that brings people together and share. People can share and celebrate. Okay, 2009 Black Saturday, the hall took on a rather sombre but an essential and celebrated role after the Black Saturday fires, and for a number of months we became a resource relief centre. I, in my annual report, made a comment. I believe it's fair to say that there have not been many other times we have been more proud of what our hall has been able to give back to community, and we'd stick by that. The hall, lots of anniversaries. In 2012, 150 years for the hall, for the area, 125 for the hall, and 70 for the fire brigade. 2016 commemorative garden dedication, and that was after a project linked to ANZAC 100 where we formed our honour roll. There we are. We had 2022 coming out of lockdown. The hall was virtually closed for 2 years, the first 2 years of COVID, and in that time past President Gail Corr, OAM, passed away. So 2023 saw a relaunch of our marketing and booking tools via our website, www.arthurskreekhall.com.au, as well as our Facebook page. And thanks to Bendigo Bank funding for that. So we would talk about our hall now as the hall with it all. Two major projects completed from the core family bequest. Central heating and evaporative cooling, a full audio-visual system, a sound system now extended to the outside areas as well. Hirers have access to what we say is a fully equipped catering kitchen and furniture. Bendigo Bank's support for our media website development and multimedia presence, and of course Nillenburg for funding for a number of projects including printing. Keeping track of milestones. We use this as part of our process that as specific achievements or openings or projects are completed, we keep a running record of that, which turns out to be a handy process, a bit like the 2-minute talk. So what's next? Today's stories are tomorrow's history. It's my catch cry all the time. When I was doing my reflections, writing my reflections over COVID and published them, at the end of my writings, I decided to do a timeline just out of interest. And you know, it's really interesting for each and every one of us perhaps to go back and just go back through the records and see what was happening through the stages of your life. Launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957, I can remember seeing it going across the sky, and so on. But an interesting exercise. As custodians, what forms our collection? Well, registers, documents, minute books, reel-to-reel tapes, silver trophies, magazines, digital copies, documentation of landmark history, local publications, everything on cassette tapes.
Yes.
What do we do with them? Celebration of events, photographs, reference books, and of course more formal recording and publishing of ACME events as seen on the display. So we celebrate the school concerts, the funerals and wakes, the garden walk, plant sales, the dances, the Arthurs Creek balls, the chocolate lilies performed here, the community service information evenings, the garden walk, and of course the commemorative stone. And we also celebrate Garden Walk in all its dimensions. And our original charter was linked to education, library services and recreation. Our current mission is to continue to achieve these goals and to serve the needs of our local and broader community. This hall has been the setting for many of our family occasions: birthdays, wedding anniversaries, engagements, weddings, funerals and other extra special events. Our next speaker celebrated a special milestone dinner at the hall. As always, the occasion was successfully wrapped up in a unique Arthurs Creek Mechanics Institute atmosphere. And one way of noting, can I say this, 60?
Oh, I'm only 60, of course.
One way of noting the 60 years of Julie's journey at that stage was we had 60 guests, and each guest had a placemat depicting a segment of Julie's life. So really simple gathering family history. I don't know why Julie makes it so hard. Okay, today's stories are tomorrow's history. So we won't take a step backwards, we'll take a step forward. Every story needs a starting point. Starting points are a critical factor in the exploratory process. Julie's not only a story researcher and gatherer, she's a very passionate and detailed storyteller. Just like the lives and times of those she traces, she too is focused on content, personality, relationships and challenges. So it's back to the beginning of the Arthurs Creek story and the hall's role in that. Remember that today's stories are tomorrow's history. Julie will be talking about starting points and the pathways they lead to. It's amazing how simple connections can trigger a string of coincidental stories. So welcome, Julie.
Welcome to our Arthurs Creek Hall, and I do thank Barbara for inviting me. My background is I'm a volunteer at our local library at Diamond Creek for the Yarra Plenty Regional Library. I have an educational background. I don't proclaim to be any historian of any sort. I've been an educator in my career and I have a passion for family history. I'm now a tutor at Diamond Valley Library. I am available for bookings 2 hours a week if people choose to book for any type of query they have in their family history. My job is to empower them with the skills on where to go, how to locate them, and how to develop their passion to find their roots for their particular family. First of all, why am I talking about family history? I've written 3 family history books. My first was my family history book called Unravelling the Threads.
Here we go.
Yay!
See, I didn't sabotage it after all.
Okay, we've got Unravelling the Threads. My second book I wrote was the story of Heather's family history, Dreams Chased and Dreams Traced. And the third book I've written was From Far and Wide, a family history for my daughter-in-law, for her family. She's part of our extended family. I'm in the process of writing another one for my other daughter-in-law, but she's Croatian. So many of the records are very hard to find and very hard to decipher when you don't speak any Eastern European languages. So that's a tricky one. Peter, do you think we want to do?
Push the space bar.
I think it's something to do with you.
Space come up.
It's not coming up.
Should
Go on, keep talking.
Okay, so can I just have a look at what I'm talking about then? It'll probably come up in a minute, but why do we do family history? What is family history? And from my interpretation, family history can be any length of time you wish to depict. It might be a whole generation across one family, maternal and paternal sides, or it might be a family's residence in one particular area and their life story, or it might be a simple series of events. It might be a shortened time frame, perhaps somebody's history within the war. You want to tell their story of where they went to enrich the lives of your family, to see their journey that they made. Why create your family history? I think it's important for us to develop a sense of where we fit in the timeline of our family. It enriches your knowledge of yourself, your understanding of yourself, and your capability, I think, to take on challenges, because you can look back and think, well, okay, over time there were hardships, maybe I can work through this through another way and things are going to get better. So for me, writing was quite therapeutic. Setting myself a time to write each day enabled me to take stock of where I was at and move forward.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. When to create your family history, if you go back a slide, Peter, the most important thing to remember is it's time's running out. We have to start writing. People need to know your story because every one of you matter. I always love the poem. When we have funerals, you often see the poem called The Dash by Linda Ellis, that dash in the middle between birth and death. We often don't know about the person until we hear their story when they've gone. We didn't know all the wonderful things they did, the special moments in their life, the special people they meant. I think it's our role to define our dash and to define the dash of those that came before us. Whether you're going to do it through just one generation, 2 or 3 or 4, I think we've got a responsibility, because each one of those people were important in who you are and possibly as a guide for the importance of how your children are going to develop their life if you have them as well. This might be what your back room looks like. You've got all the papers there, but one day I'll get them ready, I'll sort them out. Mum gave them to me. We've got 2 pieces of old photography that after Peter's mother died, we discovered them at her brother's place when he was selling the property, and nobody knew who they were. The glass was broken and they'd been in the shed for 30 years. And I've got some interesting stories about those to tell in a minute. So you need to sort things out. You need to get yourself organised. When I'm at the library, I often see people come in, and this might be their briefcase. They sit there and open their briefcase and out come the papers. No order. These are the papers. I need some help. I want to start. So my training as an educator has always been, let's give the person the skills, take it slowly, step by step, empower them. Part of our role in the library is to empower people to learn new skills and to take on new opportunities on how they can learn something new and gain pleasure through the process that they might like to share with others. You might already be looking at ways you can publish simple family stories. We made a series for our grandson called Where's Harry? And every time we took Harry on an outing or an excursion, we made a book for him. He's now got about 20 in that series. Harry over the years has been to many places. Now he's 11. That's a wonderful treasure of his growing up. That can come in what they call a saddle stitch book. Another thing Peter's made for each of the grandchildren is an annual yearbook. Put the simple photos in of things they've done with you, put little notations on them, funny sayings, something again, quite simple. Learn how to do something on a small scale, and then if you're looking to develop a family history in a bigger book, you're now developing the skills and the confidence to take that next step. You might have had important weddings. Our son was married in this hall. This was the first book I ever made, and lovely celebration of that particular occasion. You might also have been on many trips. You kept travel journals. Why not put the travel journals and the emails you sent home and make them into a book, telling the story of the places you've been. In 50 years' time, your children might look at that and say, oh, is that what Mum and Dad wore in those days? Is that what they ate for dinner when they were in Turkey? Another thing that you may not realise you're already doing, but that's family history. In our family, we had Peter's father, who I remember in his later years wrote his memoirs, and he used to have a scrapbook unlined on the middle of the dining room table, and every time he walked past it, he would write a little note for himself. Oh, I remembered the day that I was upstairs with Dad. He was a watchmaker, and a lady dropped a threepence on the ground, and nobody saw it. And this was when things were tough. And at the end of the day, he went down and found that threepence, and that meant an incredible amount to him. So his memoirs were all handwritten, and then Peter's sister typed them up, and they're for us to celebrate. And I've used those as parts of Peter's story too. We had the Arthur's Creek book, Snapshots of the Past, which was a wonderful book that Colette Apted and I created with much of the hall material in a photographic collection, and that's a wonderful resource for putting everything in place. The little book on the left-hand side is Willow Grove Farm, which you probably saw in the photo before, was Meadowvale, where the orchardists had their field day. Peter's mother and father moved into that house into 1950, and when they both died, the home was sold to a local family in Arthur's Creek, and as a gift and housewarming for that family, Peter wrote a book, The Willow Grove Farm, its beginnings, and the wonderful occasions that his family had had there. So writing your home story is another avenue for family history.
Just so you know.
Oh, and just so you know, this was a very special one. It's on the back table. Just so you know, our kids are always saying, Mum, why have you got so much clutter? Oh gosh, why do you keep all those glasses on the bench? Why is that there for? So Peter took photos of everything, and he wrote the little notations of why they were important to us, what the occasion was, and why we treasure them. And so now they've got a context. They can go through the list when we're gone and decide, well, what will we keep, what will we give away? But they
If they dare.
If they dare. But little moments for them to realise that everything in your home tells a story, and it's all part of you. So if you want to keep the clutter, I say keep it, enjoy it, and love it. Beginning your project. So the first thing is, I suppose, if you're going to start something like this, what's the scope of it going to be? Is it going to be something small? Is it going to be, perhaps it's your 50th wedding anniversary, you want the family to know your story, your 50 years together, you might want to write a simple story. That could be a beginning. It might be a simple story about one family's lifetime in a particular area over 3 generations. You choose the approach, whether you're going to make a photo book. Might be, some people tell me they might like to write a play, they might like to do a presentation and write a talk. You're writing your family history, but we need to plan it well in advance for what we want to achieve from it. Think big, but I think start small. You might look at something like that and think, oh, a 200-page book that took 3 years to write, no way could I do that. Think small, think of the little snapshots you could do that might give you an opportunity. So who's the intended audience? When I wrote my book, the only audience was myself and my family. I had no other anticipated audience because it was purely for me to make those discoveries, to make the connections and join the dots. When I've made other books, I've made them for more extended families. When you start, you also need to consider what resources and skills you've got and what others you'll need to acquire to make your project. So you might start, you might do your investigation, and of course you're going to have to develop a family tree if that's what you choose, how you're going to save your files, what skills you might need. You might choose to get your DNA done, to have that done to give you a guide to see whether you're on the right track. A lot of people don't like the notion of DNA, but I had a very unusual experience with a very close friend of mine. He asked for my help on his family tree, and I helped him, and we had it all beautifully created. We'd done all the correct things, verified the documentation that we'd got, had first-hand documents, had wonderful stories of important people connected to Ballarat and the development of Ballarat and the gardens at Ballarat. And then one day his granddaughter said, I've got to do a project for school, we've got to get our DNA done. Pa, can you get yours done? So Pa decided to get his DNA done, but when we got the results back, when I looked at the results with Daryl, out of 2,500 people we had in his tree, there was not one DNA match to it. So you've got to be careful when you're going ahead and taking that leap into family history, that, you know, there may be times when You get a fright that something's not as yet appeared. It was all about keeping face. Sometimes the stories weren't always told or written down to make things look good for that particular time. So he had no family that he knew of. He was a single child, loving family he grew up with, but now he's got 7 half-brothers and sisters in Western Australia and a half-niece. His sister died in England and his half-niece is now corresponding with him in England. So he is very, very grateful that he's had the opportunity, what we call his cultural family. We still celebrate all those things that nurtured his being the person that he is, but now he's got more the biological connection, which he feels so whole about. But that's your own choice to do that, but if you do choose to do a DNA test, you can get incredible results. How are you going to organise the format of your project? I'm quickly going to go through that. You'll have the title to consider, the layout, the number of pages. Will you have a table of contents? The chronology, will you go starting with yourself and go back, or start from the first person in your chosen time zone? Might be the first person who arrived in Australia. Your introduction, your conclusion. Are you going to have a theme for your book? And I'll talk about that in a minute. Photographs, maps, documents, all sorts of embellishments that are going to attract the reader. I always think of when you watch people love, who do you think you are? Why do you think we love it? We get immersed in that setting. We get immersed in all the facts, all the information, as if we're walking in those shoes. Many people tell me, oh, I looked at Ancestry last night and I pushed a button and I've now got my family tree. And they're like the people with the birth and the death and the dash. But who were they? What were their lives like? What sort of people were they? How did they treat each other? What were their values? No knowledge whatsoever. If you go to your family history, you've got to be prepared to dig deep. You don't just want facts, you want some personal information and also in terms of the context. You can flick through all of those. All those things are going to be so important when you're preparing and organising your files, whether you're going to just have hard copies of things and save them, alphabetise them. Are you going to scan them? Are you going to optimise any photographs so that they're the right calibre to be loaded onto software programs? How are you going to sequence them, label them? Who's going to proofread and spell check them? Will you involve others in the project? Is it going to be something, say, 75 years of living in a certain area? Am I going to get my neighbours to help? Am I going to get other members of my family? You could do it collaboratively. You might be one of those people who wants to have control over it all, maybe accept information from other people. You might want to do it all on your own. The other important consideration is the cost. If you're going to do it for a family, the cost of producing Peter's book was $330 for one copy. So if you're going to make them for the family for 10, 15 people, it can get expensive. You might need to work out, are you going to charge people if they wish to buy one? And I think our family all volunteered for that, except our children, of course, didn't have to pay. But other siblings decided that they'd like to buy one as well. So the cost of publication can be expensive.
$11.
Whereas if you're starting small on a simple book, this is done through Photo Books or Us, that's $11 for a simple book. So build your way up, increase your skills, work through your skills. So what have you got as your starting point of your theme? Who, what, where or when are you going to start? Is it going to be a particular item you might have discovered in your family? A treasure that you've carried down? This is the chest that one of Peter's ancestors came to Australia with. That could be opening the lid, could be the title of your book, it could be a starting point. This may have been one of the convict shawls when they boarded the boat. This may have been a patchwork quilt that was handed down for generations. These might be the slides that Mum and Dad took on their big European trip. Who knows what's on them? Let's investigate. Let's make their story. Here's the unearthed shoe. what story could it have told? In my family, in my mother's family, they were shoemakers. This could have been something that they worked on. This might have been a tiny baby's shoe. Could that be the starting point? This is razor cut wire. I wonder if in generations way back, this could have been the starting point for your story. Or as it is in Peter's, it might have been the chain, dragging the chain, or splicing the rope. Or it could have been the story of somebody else in my extended family that carried a case like this off the ship when he arrived from Yugoslavia as a refugee. What do you think was in the bag? What would you have carried?
Photos.
He was too embarrassed to have an empty case, so he put a brick in it. What a beginning. The journey itself, coming to Australia, could be the starting point for any of your beginnings. And how are you going to hook the readers into connecting in your stories? What added material have you located to link your stories into a meaningful social and local context? And that's like that immersion when we love watching Who You Think You Are. Being an educator in my career, I wanted our books to be something that would be like a coffee table book that my grandchildren and our grandchildren could look at, learn from, smell, feel, taste what it was like in that era. You can't just give facts. There's got to be emotion, connection with it, and something that links with children. So ready, steady, go. Start writing. It's time to define your dash, that important line. You're living it now because your story matters. I'm quickly going to whip through this, but I want to tell some interesting stories along the way. Wait there, because I've got to start that part. Unravelling the Threads was the title for my family book. I was always an avid sewer. My mother worked in Coburg, as did my father in the textile mills. My father worked for Prestige Stockings. My grandmother was a forewoman after coming from England at Yarra Falls, and she was a wool mender. Way back in Ireland, my father's family were Irish damask weavers. So threads were important. Unravelling those threads for me was really important because the only things I had from my mother was her original birth certificate, my grandmother's original birth certificate, and my grandmother's marriage certificate. So I had to locate all the information that did take me 5 or 6 years to locate to find any connection. So that was my start. But in writing my book, it had a different beginning to Peter's book.
Huh?
Leave that, I think we'll leave that. Yeah. So my book had an introduction. Tell your story of what the timeline's been for the collection of your material. How did you feel writing it? What was your purpose in doing it? And my important thing I told my boys, never lose my password to Ancestry.com because it's a never-ending story. It keeps going. Things that I wrote in 2015 have changed slightly in some cases. Now you can do a revised edition. If you were making your family history online in a blog, you'd be able to update it instantly. To update this, I'd probably be a little bit more difficult. First of all, you've got to think of what you're going to have as your starting point. This is an example of how I did it. I did it from the first generation that came to Australia, and I listed them in order of their arrival in Australia. I talked about the paternal side of the family and the maternal side of the family at the one time because I wanted to look across the generation and look at their similarities and differences. My beginning for my book was from an Irish blessing. Having Irish heritage, my mother always talked about I had the luck of the Irish, so I had to decipher were the Irish in my family lucky? What happened? Well, a lot of them died young and one died in jail, so I don't know whether they were lucky, but that was a proposal I had for my book. But in writing the other main component of my book, everybody in my book was linked to a thread. And the threads were important because if you look at the notion of how a cloth is woven, you have the warp and the weft. Now the warp, to my way of thinking, was the vertical lines, the strength, the direct lines in your family tree. And the weft was the wafting thread that went in and out, that wasn't necessarily your family, but the people you met along the way, the people that influenced your family and maybe guided them in some way. And I love the other component of fabric is the woof, and the woof is the strength and the endurance of that fabric that is created by the sum of the total of them all, the direct family lines, but also the people that were there and the connections that they had at the time.
Next one.
Right, Peter's book was called Dreams Chased, Dreams Traced. I get that's a tongue twister saying that. And Dreams Chased was in fact Dreams Chased. It was the start of COVID. COVID was a difficult time. I didn't cope with it particularly well, and I had this overarching panic that I had half of Peter's book done, the other half was waiting to be done, and if something happened to Peter or I, as in the beginning of COVID, nobody knew what was going to happen. What was going to happen to all this knowledge I had? Who would be able to pick up the threads I've got? Who'd be able to pick up my files, my notes? And what was going to happen to the book that was half made online if the company that was making the book collapsed during lockdown? Where would I be? So there was this urgency to do it. So Peter's dreams were tracing the dreams of all the connections in his family along the line. So when we look at if you can just whip through this, Peter's family, I did his similarly, starting with the earliest arrivals in Australia, right up to the present day. I numbered each one of them. I gave each of them a colour according to whether they were maternal or paternal family. Table of contents was important because I'm going to show you some unusual links in a moment with that. My daughter-in-law's book was created for her, not only for her, but I told her father I was making it for his daughter, and I told his daughter I was making it for her father, so neither of them knew who it was for. It was a surprise, but it came at a time in life that it was important to let them see what they'd achieved and to take stock. Sometimes you have to step back and you have to celebrate with people what they've achieved if they're going through a rough time. So think about moments in your life, what you could do to make somebody feel good. Lauren's family history was created differently. I separated the maternal side from the maternal side, and Lauren's family had the addition of having the wonderful links back to Westgarth Town. She's a descendant of the Zeeble family from Westgarth Town, so that was a wonderful awakening for me of the early history. Peter's family history is an interesting one. Peter started off with the story talking about the Drapers and talking about the early history with the Ryder family as well. But what are the hooks in his story that really got me in? Okay, we can talk about the people in the chronological order, but as I said before, sometimes the connections of those people and the intertwining of the lives of those people can really awaken your interest in family history. We've got 4 people there that are circled. We've got Catherine Donovan, a convict. She was in the 2nd generation. We've got Thomas Norton Stratton, a convict in the 2nd generation. We've got Mary Jane Medhurst in the 3rd generation. And we've got Peter's mother, Lila Joyce Parsonage, in the 5th generation. Yet she's got a link to Arthur's Creek earlier than any of the names we've mentioned today. Nobody knew. 5 of Joyce's family were convicts. You can roll on, Peter. This is the early days of Arthur's Creek, as we saw before, with William Ryder and Charles Draper, and there's Peter's mother's and father's house before they bought it, of course, in the earlier era. Then we've got the subdivisions, the early maps of, we can see where John Ryder's land is, where Charles Draper's land is, and Peter's mother and father were 29A, 29AA and 29AB. This gentleman, Thomas Norton Stratton, came out to Australia. He was born in 1815, died in 1887. It was interesting reading his convict records and how he came to Australia, what his history was. He was described having a trade of a groom. He had complexion sallow, eyes grey, inoffensive with one exception, hair brown, eyes grey. But why was he important to this story? Thomas Norton Stratton came to Australia and was assigned to Charles Arthur Esquire. Charles Arthur Esquire was the nephew of Governor Arthur, and he was the brother of Henry Arthur, who discovered Arthur's Creek. So if I just looked at dates and times and not looked at in depth at documents, I would never have found that connection. So that opened a whole interesting discovery of the life of Charles Arthur Esquire, parallel with Henry Arthur's story as well. But it got even more interesting. Peter, just scroll through those, because that's just an overview for you to see how you can set up a page, how you can have background. The other important, interesting link with that, so Thomas Norton Stratton, number 5, was a convict. There was another convict, Catherine Donovan. She might have had that bonnet on over there, and she came with that shawl wrapped around her shoulders. But how's she connected to the story of Melbourne and Arthur's Creek? If you looked at the female Cascades registry and the female convicts database in Tasmania, you would see that Catherine Donovan was a feisty young woman. She had her head shaved. She was on bread and water for 2 weeks because she'd been temperamental. So she was sent off from Hobart, far away she could, to a place up near Launceston, a place called Ben Lomond. And unbeknown to us, till I questioned it, Ben Lomond was managed by a person called John Batman. John Batman then met many of the people with the Port Phillip Association, one of which was Henry Draper, sailed up the river, sailed up on the Rebecca, and stopped at a place called Indented Heads. And this is where another correlation happens. The land on which my family, who were the first settlers in Indented Heads and the Bellarine Peninsula, was the land where the Rebecca was meant to have landed and the first hut built. So we've got correlations between one family and another. Then the third link, Mary Jane Medhurst. How could she be linked with all of this? Who was this Mary Jane Medhurst? She was a housekeeper, her sister was a cook. They came to Australia in the 1870s. They'd been working for a person called Henry Reid, not the Reid family from this area. Henry Reid, who was one of the biggest ship owners and one of the most wealthiest men of the era. Henry Reid was one of John Batman's best friends. He gave him money at his wedding. He went to his wedding, and Henry Reid also conducted the first religious service in Melbourne. So the connections between history of Arthur's Creek and me looking at Peter's family history opened up connections with lots of other stories of important times that made history real. It wasn't just copying facts, it was looking at connections and people. I'm going to leave it just there. I'm going to flick through some of the others.
What about the coincidence?
The what?
Coincidence of Mum moving there.
Oh, the other coincidence was that Joycey moved there, of course, and she knew nothing of this. She moved in 1850 and 1950 and knew nothing of this story and how she would have loved it. She was an avid reader, loved watching anything historical, and how she would have just been incredibly amazed by it. Quickly finishing up, people might ask, how do you start? I used Ancestry.com. I'm not advocating any particular program. This is my way out. I did it, and it's one example of many ways you could do it. Can you just go back one, Peter? Sorry. I also use a program called Family Tree Maker. There's an option to sync your family tree with Family Tree Maker, and there's an option called in the publishing section where you can create a smart story. It uses artificial intelligence. If you choose to look for a starting point, that might be an avenue for you to print off, to save what you've done in your base work for Ancestry, and it will summarise it in a story in sequential order. For somebody that doesn't know where to start, that's a great option for you. That's particularly how you do that. Looking at presentation software that I've used, Memento photo books have wonderful inspiration through their family history web pages of different presentations you can use. Lots of examples of book types. The other book version that Peter's used before, the Little Books, is a local company. It's set out in Thomastown. You can do many bulk orders there, and you can go and click them off and collect them directly without paying for the postage. Looking at different things, when you're looking and developing your stories, please add lots of interesting things to capture your audience, capture those children and get them interested in learning, get them interested in how it was. And label everything. When you're doing your family history, label the generations, what era you're talking about, number them carefully. Don't presume people that are reading it have got your knowledge. You know what you're meant to be doing, but they may not understand that. Lots of ways to organise your writing. 52 Stories collection's a wonderful collection of individual questions. You might have your family of 20 with all your relatives might like to make a book about their family, and this is a series of simple questions that you might consider when you're writing. There's some of the sample questions there, different things you might look for in your research, different things we have at the library. Liz Pigeon is our family historian and local historian at the library. She's got many blogs on the Yarra Plenty Regional site. Have a look at those. Many of the items I've talked about on them. If we looked at the full size of it, you'd see all the ways you can do research. Family History Help Online, you can book into any of the workshops. I believe there's one at Watsonia as well. I haven't met her. I think her name is Irene. And I've met the lady at Whittlesea, and I've just gone blank. At the Whittlesea Library as well, she has family history sessions as well various times during the week. So take stock of where you're at, celebrate what you've achieved, and let others know about it, and enjoy looking at how you can create your family story. Start thinking big, but start small. Get the help of somebody else in your family if you don't feel confident, or take some classes and take it step by step, because it can be very rewarding and make us feel good in the big picture of things. So thank you for coming today. Thank you for listening. I did enjoy sharing it. If you'd like to have a look at the books, I've left them up the front, and we've got the other material at the back. So thank you.